This is Trust the Process, a webinar series by TransPerfect's Trial Interactive, the best source for all things trial master file and passing inspections. Each episode presents conversations with industry experts discussing real-world experiences, strategies, and tips that clinical sponsors can apply directly to their own clinical operations. The series examines the nuances of maintaining real-time TMF health, building and managing effective teams, collaborating seamlessly with CROs and vendors, harnessing the power of technology, and discovering strategies to simplify the maintenance of a TMF. Join us each episode as we share all of the essentials that will help you become a TMF champion. Always operationally excellent, always inspection ready.
Okay, welcome back to the third episode in our Trust the Process podcast with Gillian and Avani. In the last episode, we discussed submission considerations. Today, we will be looking at the overall QC process. So let's get this kicked off. Okay, so let's get stuck in. So Jill, what is your experience of document processing? Have you ever had to do document QC in your vast experience?
Absolutely. And although I may be a director and responsible for managing some of these processes, I kind of wouldn't have got where I am today if I hadn't have done some of that processing myself. So I started very much at the ground level. I have scanned documents, I have indexed documents, I've applied metadata, and I've also done QC. And we've discussed some of those processes. So I think we really need to kind of look at, I guess, what we need to have from a QC perspective, I think. So let me ask you, Avani, what if you were QCing a document, what are some of the things that you would be looking for? Documents already in the eTMF, you're responsible for doing that first line or first level of QC, if you will.
So to me, there's almost two parts of that QC process. I think the first one is where you're looking at the actual quality of the document, and I know that you outlined a lot of those checks that you would do during the pre-submission in episode 2. But to me, you're checking things like, are you uploading to the right protocol? Has this person submitted the right protocol document to the right study? Does it already exist, i.e. duplicate? So I know that a lot of eTMF technologies now have the capability of detecting duplicates based on metadata. So is the document already present in the system, just slightly with different metadata? I think one of the biggest things during the QC process is checking all of the pages of a document. If you think of something like an IB, 300-400 pages, you're at QC checking that every single page of that document is present in the system. So are there any missing pages? Are those pages in the right order? So you're talking more about the quality of the document. You're looking at groupings. So does a translation have the English version attached, and the certificate of translation? So there's a whole number of what I would call quality checks that you have to do. Is the TMF even ready for the TMF? And things like patient identifiers, PII. So you're checking those sorts of things in the first half of that. I think in the second part of that, you're talking about metadata application. So you're applying things like the date of the document. You're looking at things like subject ID and taking that out and putting it in the right fields. Looking for version number, things like that. So there's almost two parts to when you're looking at QC. You're looking at the document content. You're making sure that it's of a high quality and to the standards that you have defined as per your SOPs. But then you're also looking at the document for the metadata that you need to extract from that and then putting it into the system as well. When we talk about QC workflows, Jill, I know I think standard when we came to the industry was a 2-step workflow, where the system would implement 2 steps, as the name suggests. But what would your recommendations be? Because I know there are a lot of different options now with clients adopting many different practices.
Yeah. And really, I wouldn't veer from that. My best practice recommendation is really always to have a fresh pair of eyes look at a document. So if one person is uploading and applying metadata, to have somebody else double check that metadata is correct. Just a second, as I said, pair of eyes. But actually, you can apply a risk-based approach, as you can with everything in clinical research now, a risk-based approach to your quality workflows. to really kind of focus your quality where it needs to be focused. So, for instance, you may want to have a QC, just a single QC workflow for, I don't know, a specific document type, whatever you decide that would be. You may want to decide to have a specific workflow for documents coming from a particular type of user. So, for instance, if that user is a very high-level manager or a director who knows the quality of those documents and knows, because they're the person who is the creator of the document, the author of the document, it's been through a quality workflow already, and then the finalized document has been put in, that may not necessarily have to go through another QC step. So that may be a document that can bypass any quality workflows that you have. Applying more of a risk-based approach to, for instance, a study. So if it's a pivotal study, you may want all of the documents to go through a quality workflow. If it's not so much an important study, you may not necessarily want to push all of the documents. So there are ways that you can apply that risk-based approach. But to me, the general practice is always to have another person look at that document before it becomes finalized within the eTMF system, and then have another step to actually look at the document and more of a quality and a cross-check with other documents once it's actually been finalized in the system. And that I would call more of a periodic TMF review, where you're not only looking at the document, but you're looking at some of the processes around the clinical trial as well. So you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the steps that you take to do QC, when I asked you, you mentioned metadata, and we've spoken a lot about that in the podcast series. And it's obviously very, very important. Avani, would you try and explain essentially what metadata is for people that might not know?
Yeah, so I mean, metadata is essentially information that describes the attributes or the properties of a document. So if you look at a document and you look at the date, that's a piece of information that is specifically about that document. So very simply, it's just information about the document. There are a collection of different properties that make that document what it is. So essentially, when it comes to QC workflow and extracting that metadata, it's just going through and finding the specific pieces that you need to capture in the eTMF.
I guess from my perspective, I also think we should talk about why that metadata is important. I think I like to think of, and this is the way the industry is going in terms of terminology now with E6R3, very much is referring to the TMF's TMF records. And when I think of TMF records, I always think of a document plus the metadata that's assigned to it, because those two together actually form a TMF record. So that's, to me, is why metadata is so important. And it becomes more important when you're dealing with things like migration, or end of study transfer, or that, where you're actually taking documents out of an eTMF system. They are much more powerful and more searchable when you actually extract the metadata in maybe an XML file with it, so that when you actually transfer or migrate, you actually take the document plus that XML file, that metadata that accompanies with it to actually form that record. And if you can get that into another system, it becomes all the more powerful. It's the document plus all of those attributes that you spoke about at the beginning. And yeah, I think that's very, very important. There are some standards around exchange of data and the importance of the metadata that you capture with it. So I think, to me, that really explains the power and the importance of metadata.
And I think, just to add to that, I think if you go back just to searchability and retrievability of a document, I know I keep saying those things in an eTMF, but they're so important, and they're based on things like the file name and the metadata that someone is adding to each and every single document. So to me, features of an eTMF, which include things like filters or basic searches or even advanced searches, they're only as good as the metadata that someone has applied to that document in order for you to be able to retrieve it. So, and to your point, I think if you think about a migration or a transfer, there's a reason why people expect to see certain things at the end of a migration, which is going to be the documents, the metadata, and the audit trail. Those are three things that are commonly, routinely provided, or that customers are asking for at the end of a study, because without those pieces, you can't recreate that study in another system, which a lot of companies tend to do, especially if they're taking that back from a CRO. Now, if you think about the metadata being missing, you essentially have to put that put those documents through another workflow for someone to apply all that metadata to make it searchable. So it's invaluable to an eTMF, and when it's used right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with metadata, I think so much now, again, with technology, so much is becoming automated. So if we think about AI, how does that fit in with things like the QC process and the workflow?
So it's interesting that we've talked about metadata. Actually, that is to me where AI or machine learning kind of comes into its own, especially with an eTMF, because in theory, if you have defined metadata fields and they're consistently defined metadata fields, and you could train a machine then to actually find those metadata fields within a document. So what it essentially means is that the machine will be taught to extract those pieces of metadata from the document. And we talked at the beginning or in the previous podcast, Avani, about file names and those, consistency of file names. Well, actually, you can combine the two so that machine learning will extract the protocol number, the site number, the country, the name of the PI. And actually, by extracting them, will then automatically almost code those documents, index those documents with those pieces of metadata. And that's hugely powerful. If you think about having 10 fields of metadata that have to be completed manually by an indexing person, if the automated metadata extraction will actually auto extract and auto code 8 of those, it means that you only then have to manually apply 2 of them, which actually speeds up your processing time. And we spoke about timeliness of documents being uploaded in the last podcast. Well, it's actually also important that you have a timeliness of processing of documents. And this may be an option in terms of speeding things up. It's pretty much prevalent in a lot of the eTMF systems. How accurate it is may be another thing. If you think about where you've got something like a date that's been manually written by a PI and notoriously doctors have terrible handwriting, how easy it is to actually extract the date from that document. So you have to have very sophisticated machine learning and algorithms behind that to actually get it to work very well. But I think if you are consistent with the metadata that it's putting, if you have documents that are, I guess, templates, documents that look the same, like a 1572 is an FDA template document, it should be fairly easy to actually extract the metadata from those documents. So it is definitely the way to go. I think what it does is it does, shall I say, reduce the errors that you can make with documents. I'm not necessarily sure it would reduce maybe the queries that we have. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Avani.
Yeah, and I think if you go back, you touched upon how good the template is and things like that. I think that goes back to what we were saying in the first episode, which was how good is that scanned? How good is the scan? Has it been OCR'd? All of that sort of thing. But then it also talks or feeds into your statement about risk-based QC workflows. So if you're able to pull out the metadata of certain document types, then maybe they can just continue to go through one step. It doesn't need to be that second step because you have something extracting the metadata. So I think for me with queries, I think it's a big one because in an ideal world, nobody wants to raise a query, nobody wants to receive a query, and nobody wants to be chased constantly about open queries in the system. So to me, it goes back to what I said, I think in the last episode, which was if you put good quality data in, so if you take the time to do something right before you even upload the document to the system, you are saving so much time and effort later down the line in terms of how many queries you have to respond to, how quick and efficient that QC workflow is, and also from your name being on multiple queries in a system, right? So if you're able to do those checks up front, I don't think we're ever going to be able to eliminate queries. I think we're all humans. We're all gonna make a mistake somewhere. And I think even with a two-step QC workflow, there's nothing to guarantee that both people have caught all the mistakes in a document, especially if it's 400 pages, for example. So to me is you want to enforce that check at multiple areas. So at submission, at QC, and then also by reviews of your TMF on a consistent basis. But there's also different types of queries that I would say. So they could be queries that are raised during your QC workflow. There could be queries that are raised after they've been through the workflow. During a standard review, someone may notice that page 5 is missing that tiny little box that no one saw during the QC workflow. So it goes back to making sure that you've got the right people doing the pre-submission checks. You've got as many fail-safes in place at QC workflow to pick that up, and then you're reinforcing that with your periodic reviews. I think you can I think you can reduce the queries a lot by just taking those simple steps up front. And I think with queries as well, I think sometimes they can be a good thing because it identifies perhaps a deficiency in your process. Perhaps it's a process that needs to be looked at. Perhaps it identifies a training need for a specific document type or a specific person. So I think everyone thinks of queries as a bad thing. Nobody wants them. But actually, if you take time to look at the metrics and what they are showing you, then they can be quite good in terms of improving your overall TMF.
I just wanted to introduce, I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's a term that I have seen used with data management and data queries. But if you have like a self-evident query where it's blatantly obvious that somebody has made a mistake when it comes to submitting it. So if it's a 1572 document, which looks the same wherever you are, and somebody's accidentally submitted that to a placeholder for a CV, to me, you shouldn't be querying that. You should be actually putting that document where it needs to go and then putting a note to the submitter to say, we got this document, you submitted it incorrectly, we have rectified it. And then you then don't actually raise the query, you just tell the submitter what they've done. I think that is another strategy that I would certainly advise clients to look at and maybe put that into business rules so that everybody understands what the expectation is. I think that that's a really good way of kind of tying it back. But yeah, even with metadata extraction, I think there will always be the need to query a document, especially if you just don't know where it goes. There are occasions where you'll come across a document within a clinical trial, and as great as the reference model is, it may not be super clear as to where that document goes. And those are the types of queries that I think do need to go back to the submitter to say, look, where do you think this document should be filed? Because with the best will in the world, you as the person who doesn't necessarily own it, if you're processing it, you're not going to know that information. So
yeah, and I think just to as a final thought on that, I think I spoke about business rules and TMF processing plans, and I think we spoke about timelines. So you may want to add in timelines for people to respond to queries as well. Yes, it's all very well that you want documents to go into the system as soon as they're finalized and as soon as they're ready. But from a query being raised, I think you may want to also say that you've got 10 business days to respond to that query, or to at least look at it and provide some sort of feedback, because it's so easy for those queries to just sit there, for people to move on and off of study, as we all know happens, and for those queries to just sit there for an extended period of time and they're all forgotten about. So I think more and more people are choosing to enforce or put some sort of time frame on queries, and then, like you say, using reporting and metrics and things like user reports to really help look at who those queries are assigned to, how long they've been open, and whether there are any trends with specific people or with specific document types.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with you. I think that's we've covered quite a lot in this podcast already in terms of the processing. It's been great catching up with you, Avani. I look forward to talking to you on the next episode.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Smith, Division President, Trial Interactive and Corporate Vice President for TransPerfect. Operational excellence and inspection readiness are not just aspirations, they are essential factors of the TMF journey. Until our next episode, stay operationally excellent and stay inspection ready.